So, thank you, Chiji, for the introduction. And thank you for bringing me to Villanova, my first time here. I was supposed to be here last year, but it didn't work out. But here I am. My paper, talk, lecture, I don't know what to call it, is titled The Future of the African Novel. I was just told that it's rather ambitious subject. And I said, is it too late to change the subject? But yeah, what I'll do is just to talk about the African novel. Basically, I'm just going to be a bit discursive, throwing up issues about the novel in Africa. And then when I finish, if I have questions, please, I'll be happy to attempt to answer your questions. So, the future of the African novel. In a sharp refutal to the efforts of a group of critics to limit and reduce African literature to a level he deemed too narrow and too subjective, Wole Soyinka said, "Pretenders to the crown of Pontifex Maximus of African poetics must learn to mind the thorns." And so from the outset, let me state that I'm aware of the thorns, and I'm not here to arrogate to myself the task of formulating a new poetics of the African novel, or to hand down any precepts and prescriptions, which is why I prefer to view this event not as a lecture, but as a talk, a reflection on the African novel. Let me also state that I'm aware of the current school of thought that resists the admissibility of the term the African novel. As recently as 5 to 10 years ago, who would have used the term African novel without much problem? But recently this term has come under scrutiny. It is decried as insufficient or too broad, a term that often mistakes a continent for a country. Africa is diverse and complex, and so are its art forms. An analysis of the novel from Nigeria will definitely show how different and how particular it is from a novel from South Africa or from Egypt. A Moroccan novel in Arabic will perhaps have more in common with a Lebanese or Palestinian novel than with a Ghanaian novel. So, let me state from the outset that I'm aware of these nuances and diversities, and yet, for the sake of this talk, I will continue to use the term the African novel, for lack of a better term, to describe a novel from any of Africa's 54 countries. And by doing this, I'm emphasizing the shared characteristics of these novels, of being written mostly in the language of an ex-colonial power and modeled mainly after the Western form of the novel, sometimes using traditional narrative devices and local content. If my attempt at defining the African novel sounds a bit tentative or even apologetic, it is because the African novel, from its inception, has never been an easy thing to define. Its aesthetic relevance, its authenticity, its purpose has always been contested. 50 to 60 years ago, when the earliest African novels started to emerge, critics treated them as anthropological documents, mining them for cultural and ethnographic information, totally overlooking or even denying their aesthetic relevance. Often, African writers had to act as their own critics in order to bring any sanity and nuance to this new field of African literature. And so African writers had to write their novels with one hand and to critique it with the other, as it were. Their critical writing has looked at language, form, content, and so many other things, all in an effort to determine what the African novel is or should be. In 1962, African writers actually met at Makerere University in Uganda to try and determine the parameters of African literature. They asked, should it be, quote, produced in Africa or about Africa? Could African literature be on any subject, or must it have an African theme? Should it embrace the whole continent? or south of the Sahara, or just Black Africa? And then the question of language. Should it be in indigenous African languages, or should it include Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, Afrikaans, etc.? Unquote. These questions and deliberations may seem rather elementary and even redundant to us now, but at the time, they were real concerns. But because the novel is a relatively new art form in Africa, it doesn't mean that there was no storytelling before colonialism. Before the novel came, all the rhetorical devices of the extended narrative were there, waiting almost to be adopted into the formal requirements of this alien art form. And it is this combination of the oral elements grafted onto the substructure of the European novel and written in European languages that has come to define the modern African novel. A predictable example of the classic African novel would be Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. I'm sure we've all read that here. Having said that, we must note that there were novels written by Africans before Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958. Novels like Sol Plaatje's Mahundi, or Cheikh Hamidou Kane's Ambiguous Adventure, or Amos Tutola's Palm Drinker, and many others, too numerous to mention here. But it is Achebe's unusual grasp of the tenor and mood of the late and post-colonial period, and his ability to express it clearly, unapologetically, pitching his tent with the colonized, and of course his ability to deploy oral rhetorical devices that make his book stand out, making it something of a model for other African writers. As the Zimbabwean writer Dambuzo Marachera found out when he was to be published by Heinemann African Writers Series, and was told by the readers that his book was too Western and insufficiently engaged or insufficiently African. But Marachera's position, as he stated in his essay, The African Writer's Experience of European Literature, is, quote, "How can Africa write as if that black Frenchman, Fanon, never existed?" And he adds, "Far from imitating the practices of past generations of European writers, African novelists have extended the possibilities and uses of fiction." And these two positions, in a nutshell, have been the opposing positions the African novel, and indeed modern African literature, has found itself occupying for a long time. Aesthetic nativism, or traditionalism, championed by writers like Senghor and the Negritudinist and all brands of African nationalist critics on one hand, and those, like Marachera, opposed to them, who see nothing pernicious in influence, who are grateful, in fact, for influence. They ask, isn't the novel supposed to be ever new and ever changing? And if this is so, isn't it logical to learn and borrow from the Europeans and Americans and other cultures? The danger of this position is that if the African novel begins to drift too far away from its originary spring, which is oral, it might lose its bearing and find itself far away, marooned somewhere in Europe, perhaps in Siberia. But like I mentioned at the start, I'm not here to hand out prescriptions or precepts, merely to reflect. And I've found that the best way to reflect is to ask questions. And so here are a few questions, which I'm directing to an imaginary young African writer, perhaps one who is just starting work on the first draft of his novel. Ask yourself, what really does the novel do? What are its raison d'etre? If, as has often been suggested, it is to illustrate or examine the human condition, then the next question would be, what does the African novel do? Or, if you are of the opinion that there's no such thing as the African novel, let me rephrase. What does the novel in Africa do? Does it exist to illustrate the African condition? And if so, what exactly is the African condition? Is it different from the general human condition due to certain historical and social factors experienced uniquely by the African? And next, who is the African? Is Africa this homogeneous, monolithic space created by the European historians and ethnographers? Or is it more complex than that, home to whites and blacks and Arabs and other races in between, with their different cultures and unique histories? I suggest to this young writer, after answering these questions, to then consider himself a novelist first and an African novelist second. He must share a table in that room imagined by E.M. Forster in aspects of the novel, sitting side by side with all the best writers in the canon: Henry James, Dickens, Thackeray, Flaubert, and yes, Achebe, and Soyinka, and Mongo Beatty, and Dambuzo Marechera. Writing away in this serene room, oblivious to any extraneous pressure, such as agents and publishers and marketers, telling him or her what to do, what to write, or what not to write. In this room, there's no skin color or privilege due to race or history, no excuses about lack of opportunities for publishing, no excuses about anything. There is only the word processor and the imagination. Let us not frighten this young writer by telling him that in the real world, the going will be much tougher. Because here in Africa, we have fewer critics to comment and to encourage the writer. We have fewer, if any at all, creative writing programs to teach and mentor the young writer and to inculcate in him or her the inescapable importance of revision and revision and revision. We have fewer bookstores to distribute his books, and as a result, we have fewer readers. Here, there are no agents and very few publishers, and often, to get all that he needs to grow as a writer, he might have to leave his home and country to other countries. Our young writer will find that out in time, and hopefully, he will come to accept this as part of his growth, of the journey to becoming a writer. And yet, despite all these difficulties waiting in his path, let me assure my imaginary young writer that the African novel has never been in a more exciting point in his life as it is now. Its subject matter has never been as multitudinous and as full of possibilities. That, at least, is one consolation of modernity. In opening up Africa like never before, modernity has provided the writer with more things to write about. And it is to a consideration of some of these emerging themes that I want to turn next. The themes, about 2 or 3, are not necessarily new. They have been broached, even if not fully, by earlier writers. And this is the interesting thing with modernity. Its problems and challenges may be complex, but they are more or less constant, even if they appear under different guises in different communities. Nothing can be more modern than the modern. But there are themes the young writer may do well to pay attention to because of the way they uniquely illustrate that nebulous thing we call the African condition. In my estimation, these are themes Africa will continue to grapple with for the foreseeable future. They are themes thrust upon Africa because of its colonial history and because of its increasing engagement with the world at large, either through travel or through new media or through trade. And the first theme I want to talk about is the novel of the city, or the theme of urbanity. Here are some facts to think about. Currently, Africa has the highest rate of urbanization in the world. It has been estimated that by 2020, Africa will have more than 11 megacities. A megacity has a population of over 5 million people. And that by 2025, Africa will have 73 cities with a population of between 1 to 5 million people. It is logical then to assume that the city, as setting, as theme, even as an aesthetic determiner, will continue to engage the African novel in the foreseeable future. How then does our young writer approach such daunting subject matter? To answer that question, let us consider what has been done with that setting by earlier writers. Writers like Chinua Achebe in No Longer at Ease, like Cyprien Ekwensi in Jagwanana, like Dambuzo Marechera in House of Hunger. For like I mentioned earlier, the problems of modernity are constant and recurring in nature. Here is a passage from the opening section of Yvonne Vera's The Stone Virgins, describing the city of Bulawayo. I quote, The city revolves in sharp edges, roads cut at right angles. At noon, shadows are sharp and elongated. Streets are wide, widest at intersections. In this city, the edge of a building is a profile, a corner, a koneni. The word is pronounced with pursed lips and lyrical minds, with arms pulsing, with a memory begging for time. A koneni is a rendezvous, a place to meet. You cannot meet inside any of the buildings because this city is divided. Here, you linger, ambivalent, permanent as time. You are in transit. The corner is a camouflage, a place of instancy and style, a place of protest. A koneni is also a dangerous place where knives emerge as suddenly as lightning. Unquote. This passage captured so well the idea of the city as conceived by the colonizer, an off-limit space, its square imposing buildings on the European model, severe, and its open streets daunting to the outsider. Designed not so much for comfort as for exposing and denying the unwanted intruder a hiding place, banishing him to the corner, the shadow zone, the fringe. And so the aspiring writer will see that the post-colonial African city, which he might take for granted as a setting for his story, has a political and racial history to its architecture. It is a space designed to emphasize class and otherness. And the question to ask will be, has all that changed with independence? Or does the new ruling class see itself as the rightful inheritor of the colonizer's space, and therefore has the right to banish its less privileged countrymen and women to the ghettos and townships, the corners? And if you think that is far-fetched, just look at our cities today, Abuja, Lagos, Nairobi, Cape Town, how they are built without provision for mass transport and mass accommodation for the workers and the poor, forcing them to live in the shanty towns and ghettos of the city outskirts, close enough to be tapped for their labor, but far enough not to be seen. Another approach to the city novel, and perhaps the most popular with the earlier generation of writers, is to see the city as evil, juxtaposed to the rural, idyllic village setting which is portrayed as the seat of tradition and family values, and all other positive values associated with African tradition. In fact, it became almost an unspoken requirement that to be seen as authentically African, a novel must be set in the village, with rivers where women go to fetch water, and the council tree in the village center where elders sit to deliberate, speaking mostly in proverbs. The city dweller visiting the village is portrayed in such novels as untrustworthy. He or she has lost their Africanness and therefore all sense of value. They are shown to be lazy, sleeping all day, drinking too much, etc., etc. But of course, the young African writer may not see the city and the village the same way the earlier generation did. To me, the city has been a place of great good. To become a writer, I left my small Nigerian town and moved to Lagos, a city of over 50 million souls. And in Lagos, I found intellectual stimulation. I found much encouragement from fellow travelers, people like myself, journalists, poets, writers. This is where the readers are, and the publishers, and the critics, and the bookstores. I suspect this view of the city would be shared by most young people today. The city has its dangers and its spiritual perils, but it also has innumerable opportunities. The novel of the city will also have such subgenres as the crime novel, although crime is universal and can be represented in both urban and rural settings, as have been proven by writers of crime novels such as Alexander Michael Smith, whose books are set in rural Botswana. Yet, I would argue that in Africa, the crime novel tends to incline more towards urban settings. The sheer intensity and challenges of life in the city, the anonymity it provides, its temptations and dangers become laboratories for the crime novel to investigate how character is transformed and molded but most of all, in the way crime novel does, to show the limitations of our idea of law and order, the basis on which modern society is built, and finally to expose the criminal and bring change and healing to the communities. The next theme I want to look at is that of the travel novel. Currently, the buzzword in African literature seems to be Afropolitan or Afropolitanism. In her essay, Baba Baba, the Nigerian Ghanaian novelist Taye Selassie defines the Afropolitan as, I quote, the newest generation of African immigrants coming soon or collected already at a law firm, chem lab, jazz lounge near you. She goes on to write, quote, you will know us by our funny blend of London fashion, New York jargon, African ethics, and academic success. Some of us are ethnic mixes, e.g. Ghanaian and Canadian, Nigerian and Swiss. Others merely cultural mutts, American accent, European affect, African ethos. Most of us are multilingual. In addition to English and a romantic or two, we understand some indigenous tongue and speak a few urban vernaculars. There is at least one place on the African continent to which we tie our sense of self, be it a nation state, Ethiopia, a city, Ibadan, or an auntie's kitchen. Then there's the G8 city or two or three that we know like the backs of our hands, and the various institutions that know us for our famed focus. We are Afropolitans, not citizens, but Africans of the world, unquote. This image of the traveling diasporic African has been seen by some critics as a bit too commercialized, a bit too middle class. These critics would argue that the newest generation of African migrant is the one trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe, often drowning in the process. But in defense of the Afropolitans, their stance is a deliberate choice aimed at countering this very negative and demeaning image of the African. But again, because it is negative does not mean it is not true. In his essay titled Afropolitan, Achilles Mbembe gives a more balanced and more historicized take on this subject. He turns the focus away from Europe and America back to Africa. He shows that even before colonialism, Africa has been a point for arrival and departure. This dynamism, this exchange of ideas between Africa and Africans and the outside world, he calls pre-colonial modernism. He goes on to say, and I quote, awareness of the interweaving of the here and there, the presence of the elsewhere in the here and vice versa, the relativization of primary roots and memberships, and the way of embracing with full knowledge of the facts, strangeness, foreignness, and remoteness, the ability to recognize one's face in that of a foreigner and make the most of the traces of remoteness in closeness, to domesticate the unfamiliar, to work with what seem to be opposites. It is this cultural, historical, and aesthetic sensitivity that underlies the term Afropolitanism, unquote. The novel is a product of particular forces of history, of its time and place. Even if it goes back in time to tackle a historical subject, it does so with a contemporary sensibility. The eye end of the telescope is firmly rooted in the questions of here and now. That is why almost all the writers of what we call the first generation African literature wrote on tradition and colonialism, while we of this generation will continue to write about travel and movement simply because there are more Africans currently traveling and living outside of Africa than ever before, because the very meaning of national borders has shifted with the advent of the internet and social media. Imagine, for instance, an African writer from Nigeria living in Belgium, married to a white Belgian with Belgian children, writing in Flemish, and still calling herself an African writer. This is the new reality, the new African writer. Suddenly, the Makerere debates of what language an African writer should write in, or even who can be called an African writer, seem so irrelevant and dated, overtaken by the facts of modern living. For travel is an expression of freedom, adventure, growth, curiosity, crossing and breaking boundaries. What colonialism did with its delineation of imaginary national boundaries in Berlin in 1884 was to imprison the African in these arbitrary national borders, and the modern world, with its insistence on travel documentation and discriminatory travel policies, seeks to keep the African in Africa, while others are free to travel anywhere at any time. By asserting his right to travel, by asserting his right to live in other places other than Africa, either as an economic migrant, or as a refugee, or as a tourist, the African is saying he also is part of this great world that God gave us. That is why, elsewhere, I refer to this new generation of writers as the post-nationalist generation. They are a generation that seek to question the idea of nationalism, especially where it seeks to confine and limit both physical and mental movement. The novel, Open City by Teju Cole, published in 2011, has a main character who is half Nigerian, half Belgian, living in New York. What is really interesting about this book by this African writer is that it is a book about New York, a celebration of the complexities and the history of the city, and the place of people like Julius in that space. Here is Julius at Ellis Island, contemplating the history of this historical port of entry where refugees from Europe were once processed before being allowed into America to become citizens. I quote, "From where I stood, the Statue of Liberty was a fluorescent green fleck against the sky, and beyond her sat Ellis Island, the focus of so many myths. But it had been built too late for those early Africans, who weren't immigrants in any case, and it had been closed too soon to mean anything to the later Africans like Kenneth, or the cab driver, or me. Ellis Island was a symbol mostly for European refugees. Blacks, we blacks, had known rougher ports of entry." So that's the travel novel. The next theme I touch upon is the ecological novel. I must mention that my last novel, Oil and Water, is on this subject matter, on the environment, and it's about the Niger Delta, which is Nigeria's oil-producing part, and it touches on these issues of environment, of people and their land, and how it's affected by the big corporations, basically exploiting the resources of this place. So the ecological novel. Of all the emerging themes in African literature, this is perhaps the newest and perhaps the least explored. Or maybe that's not strictly true. Maybe that's what the West thinks, with its sometimes cornering of issues of global warming and climate change and carbon emission, with endless conferences that really bear little result. After centuries of cutting down their forests and spraying DDT in their rivers and releasing harmful gases into the atmosphere through their home appliances, most of these Western countries are now turning around and saying it is actually African and Asian women who are the chief perpetrators of global warming by cooking with firewood. I guess the belief is that the African is ignorant about environmental conservation and must be educated and converted. But thinking about it, our cultural life has been about conservation. There has always been an attempt through ritual and religious observances to maintain a harmony between the human world and the animal and plant world. This is exemplified in the recognition that not only animals, but even plants have spirits and souls, and they can be homes to spirits and other unseen beings. In most communities, before a tree is cut down, certain rituals must first be carried out. This is the same with killing of animals, which was always done for food, not for sport. It is obvious that such taboos and restrictions were created by the traditional society to conserve nature. I came to a realization of the enormous importance of this thematic strand in our literature after the publication of my novel, Oil and Water. Since the book came out, I have become something of an environmental activist. I go to readings and people just want to know about the activities of Shell and Texaco in the Niger Delta. As reluctant as I am to use up the place of an environmental activist, I am also made aware that this is another aspect of the modern African experience that the writer, the artist, simply cannot afford to ignore. Our forests are fast disappearing. Our mineral resources are being exploited daily by foreign corporations without regard to their sustainability. So, finally, this is what I call the poverty porn theme in African literature. Poverty porn novel. In his essay, An Image of Africa, Chinua Achebe remarks on certain tendencies by colonialist writers to portray Africa in a negative light. Travelers, explorers, missionaries, diaries, all claiming the African has no soul or has two heads or eats snakes or things like that. To Joseph Conrad, the African is nothing but a savage, formless, waiting by the river as Marlowe's boat cruises past. To Joyce Carey, the author of Mr. Johnson is this childish, naive native who rightly deserves his tragic end. This stereotyping, what my fellow Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie in her talk calls the single story, didn't end with the colonialist writers. It continues today on CNN and other Western media covering Africa, who uses it as a shorthand to portray all aspects of life in Africa. Gradually, this usage has seeped into the nomenclature of the African writer. I commented on this in a review I did of the novel We Need New Names by the Zimbabwean writer Noviolet Bulawayo. I felt that her novel showed a certain anxiety to cover all the African topics such as AIDS, war, hunger, etc. I call this anxiety performing Africa, and I quote from my review. To perform Africa is to inundate one's writing with images and symbols and allusions that evoke, to borrow a phrase from Aristotle, pity and fear, but not in a tragic sense, more in a CNN Western media coverage of Africa poverty porn sense. We are talking child soldiers, genocide, child prostitution, female genital mutilation, political violence, police brutality, dictatorships, predatory preachers, dead bodies on the roadside. The result for the reader isn't always catharsis, as Aristotle suggested, but it's direct opposite, a sort of creeping horror that leads to a desensitization to the reality being represented, end quote. Of course, there was a pushback to my review. Some people claim that I misunderstood the novel. At best, or at worst, I was being hypercritical. But far from that, I think her book is brilliant. All I'm doing is showing a certain trend which are traced back to the rise of the Cain Prize for African literature, whose winning stories tended to dwell upon this desperate, stereotypical image of Africa. I call this style of writing the Cain Price aesthetic. In her pushback against my essay, one African writer says that Bulawayo is simply portraying the reality of Zimbabwe, and that it is the duty of the writer to portray all the bad as well as all the good. I disagree. The novel does not represent by inundating with image. It represents by carefully selecting the right image to evoke the required response. It achieves its effect through the intensity of that portrayal. In that way, the novelist is like a curator, selecting the most impressive, the most lasting image to portray and represent an idea. Inundating the audience with endless images of suffering is not the same as illustrating what suffering means. Suffering here becomes a metaphor, a tool to explore character, but not an end in itself. I will conclude by urging the young African writer to follow his heart or her heart, and not to be intimidated by all the voices telling him or her what to write about. To pitch his tent with the underrepresented, women, children, all the marginalized, and to speak about them. To remember that the writer is the most fearless, the one most willing to go where everyone else is afraid to go. He or she sends his imagination far into the future and brings back to us the tales of what is yet to come. The natural place of the writer is as a transgressor. He must be rooted in culture, but he must question tradition. Break away from tradition where necessary, for tradition is only there to guide us, a road sign, not a destination. The only true destination is the future, not the past. That's the essay. But one thing I want to add is that I am aware that I haven't said much about language in African literature, and this is a very important subject. It's been endlessly discussed and debated, going back all the way to the Mekerere conference that I mentioned earlier, and there has emerged two schools, basically the ones who support the use of foreign European languages, colonial languages, and the ones who oppose it. So that has been generally the situation with African literature. And people like Ngugi Thiong'o are very good example of those who support the use of local languages and traditional languages, and he writes his novels in Gikuyu and then translate it back into English and publish it. I think it's really good to support the writing in traditional languages. Great, admirable. Our languages should be, developed and kept alive through literature, and that's really the best way to keep languages alive. But having said that, I'm also aware with people like Chinua Achebe who said that we have to write in English language. Nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, it's important that we do that so as to be heard, so as to be read by people who may not be able to speak the local languages. This makes sense to me. I was reading one essay by Milan Kundera. He's talking about Kafka, who was a Czech citizen, but he wrote in German. He saw himself as a German writer, and he said that if Kafka had chosen to write in the Czech language or Yiddish, we may not have, been reading Kafka now, because writing in German actually made him more accessible. And even after his death, even though he wrote in German, it took about 20 years for his, translators and his, whatever, to push his books and make them what they are today for us to really read them. So if you had written in a manual language, what the critics Deleuze and Guattari call manual language or manual literature, if you had done that, you can see the difficulty of how, you know, the book will eventually come to us. So that's one consideration to think about. Writing in a major language, a manual writer writing in a major language, a colonial subject writing in the language of the colonizer, makes the work really accessible, available, and makes it say what is required to be said by the writer, because sometimes there are things you want to say and you want to be heard, and writing in other languages may not really get you there. So that's another thing I think the African language of the future, or the writer of the future, will have to think about what language to write in, traditional or European colonial language. Anyway, that's my thoughts, reflections on the African novel. Thank you for listening, and if you have questions or comments. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. A lot to think about, a lot to also talk about. So at this moment, we want to open it up for questions, comments, remarks, based on what...
Disagreements.
Grievances. Airing of grievances. Yes?
Do you think your message to the African writer that you're giving off could be given to anybody in any profession, and that would help them?
Any profession?
As in, obviously not as specific as the themes you use, because those are specific to the African writer, but just the idea that eventually you're going to have struggles and you're going to have this, and you have to be able to deal with it, and not everything's going to come easy for you.
Yeah, I think so. Some sections of what I said, you know, I think you can apply them to any profession, aspiring young person coming into certain field. Definitely must think about what has been done by others in that field, you know, and what he or she hopes to do, and to, you know, think carefully about that. That's basically what I'm trying to say, I think. But of course, I'm being specific to African literature and about writing and the novel in Africa.
I'm going to confess, first of all, that I'm relatively untutored in African literature, so this question may be naive, but I'm wondering whether you see a tradition or a practice of using magic realism in African literature that's comparable to that in Latin American literature, because in some ways that strikes me as almost a deliberate departure on the part of Latin American writers to get away from the impositions of a more kind of conventional European approach. I don't know whether that seems accurate or not, but that's...
Yeah, well, it makes sense. Even if it's not accurate, it makes sense. In Africa, I don't know if it came about as a departure or as an escape or a rejection of the traditional realist novel. What I have to say is that it's always been there in Africa. Magical realism can trace its roots back to the folk tales and, you know, and the epics and, you know, kind of folkloric narrative techniques. So it's always been there. In fact, we can call Chinua Achebe's novel as magical realist, because once you enter the field of the metaphysical, you are entering the field of magical realism. The novel, the Western novel, is mostly described as a realist novel, which rejects any mystification, which is based in science, which is based in, you know, in all this literal-minded, yeah. So the opposite is, of course, the non-Western. Latin America falls into that, and it's also part of their tradition. So basically what people like Chinua Achebe did was to carry these folkloric devices and put them in the Western realist novel, and kind of design a new form of the novel, which is the African novel, you know. And it depends then on how far you want to go, in what direction you want to go. People like Ben Okri, for instance, really push it towards the magical, towards the folkloric, you know, with spirits appearing and talking to people, with cows flying in the air, which is a bit too much for me. But that's magical realism. And it is, of course, a kind of post-colonial